My family threw me a baby shower in the backyard. My mother held my baby and said, "Osut, you gave birth before your sister? You betrayed us?" Then she threw my baby into the fire. My sister raised her glass and laughed. "You brought this on yourself." I screamed and ran forward. But what happened next shook me to my core. Margaret Williams sat on the edge of the hospital bed, cradling her week-old daughter Emma in her arms. The soft morning light streaming through the window illuminated the baby's tiny face, and Margaret's heart was filled with love. This was the first time in her life she had felt unconditional love. She gently kissed Emma's soft cheek. "My little angel," Margaret whispered. "I'll protect you, no matter what." Emma gave a tiny yawn, and Margaret smiled. Tomorrow, she would take her daughter back to her parents' home, and her mother Helen was planning to host a baby shower for her over the weekend. Just thinking about it made her stomach tighten. Her cell phone rang, with Mother displayed on the screen. Margaret took a deep breath before answering. "Hello, Mother." "Margaret, everything is ready for tomorrow's pickup." Helen Williams's voice always had a commanding tone. "James will come to get you and that child. I have to prepare for the baby shower." "Thank you, Mother." "But it's not that child, it's Emma," Margaret gently corrected her. "Your first grandchild." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "Yes, well." Helen's voice was cold. "Anyway, tomorrow at 10. Don't be late." After the call ended, Margaret sighed. Her mother had never once congratulated her on Emma's birth. When Margaret had announced her pregnancy, Helen's first words were, "Ladies have children after they're married," words that had been repeated many times since. Margaret gazed at a photo of her fiancé David. He was currently working in Africa with Doctors Without Borders. When he heard the news of Emma's birth, David had reportedly shed tears of joy. However, he couldn't return home in the middle of his mission and wouldn't be able to attend the baby shower. "Daddy will come see you soon," Margaret told Emma. "Daddy is a very kind and brave person. Do you know some people earn over $10,000 a month just by posting Reddit stories on YouTube? No face, no voice, just a laptop. I'd do it too, link below if you're curious. He loves you so much." A nurse entered the room and began the final discharge check. "Is the father not here?" she asked kindly. "He's working overseas," Margaret answered. "But my father will come pick us up tomorrow." "That's nice," the nurse smiled. "Grandpa must be thrilled." Margaret managed a faint smile. Her father James was indeed happy. When she showed him Emma's photo, tears had welled up in his eyes. But that was only when Helen wasn't around. James Williams was a reserved, gentle man. He was a history professor at a prestigious university in Virginia, beloved by his students. At home, however, he always yielded to Helen's strong will. Margaret loved her father, but sometimes she was disappointed by his indecisiveness. If only Dad were stronger, Margaret had thought countless times. He had silently accepted the fact that her sister Becky was always their mother's favorite. Becky. Margaret felt complicated emotions rise within her at the thought of her sister's name. She always seemed smarter, more beautiful, and more successful than Margaret. At least in Helen's eyes. Becky was a successful lawyer with no children from her marriage to Brad. When Margaret announced her pregnancy, Becky had offered her congratulations on the surface, but there was something cold in her eyes. Margaret later learned that Becky and Brad had been undergoing fertility treatments. Margaret didn't hate her sister. Rather, she wished to bridge the deep gap between them. She secretly hoped that Emma's birth might be that bridge. The next day, James arrived as promised to pick up Margaret and Emma. When he held his granddaughter, tears welled up in his eyes. "She's beautiful," James said in an emotional voice. "She looks like you did as a baby." Margaret gently squeezed her father's arm. "Thank you, Dad." In the car, James occasionally glanced at Emma in the back seat through the rearview mirror. "Helen is very busy preparing for the baby shower," he said cheerfully. "It's going to be a wonderful party for you." Margaret tried to smile, but couldn't help feeling anxious. Her mother's perfect parties always made her uncomfortable. "Is Becky coming?" she asked. "Oh yes, of course," James answered. His voice sounded a bit tense. "She and Brad are looking forward to it." Margaret confirmed that Emma was asleep and spoke in a low voice. "Dad, tell me honestly, does Mom really want to throw me a baby shower? Or is it just for appearances?" James glanced briefly at Margaret. There was sadness in his eyes. Marg, your mother, she loves you in her own way. Try to understand. It was the usual answer. Margaret silently nodded and looked out the window. Watching Virginia's beautiful countryside roll by, she thought about tomorrow's baby shower. The whole family would be there. Relatives and friends too. And she would have to pretend to be part of a happy family. As the car turned into the long driveway of her parents' home, Margaret's heartbeat quickened. The large colonial-style house with its white columns came into view. The house where she grew up. And now, the place she was returning to with her daughter. Here we are, James said brightly. Let's bring Emma home. Margaret looked down at her baby and whispered softly, It's okay, Emma. I'm here with you. On the morning of the baby shower, Margaret woke up early. Helen's voice from the next room had her nerves on edge. Not blue tablecloths, pink ones. Helen was instructing someone. My daughter had a girl. Get every detail perfect. Margaret took a deep breath as she held Emma on the bed. Her mother was taking charge of everything without even asking what she wanted. The typical Helen Williams show was beginning. Good morning, Margaret. Turning around, she saw her father James standing in the doorway. He smiled gently and came closer to look at Emma. She's been in a good mood all morning, Margaret said. Dad, today it'll be fine, James interrupted her. Today is a special day for you and Emma. Everything will work out. His words lacked confidence, but Margaret gratefully squeezed her father's hand. At 2 p.m., guests began to arrive. Margaret sat on the living room sofa, holding Emma. Her maternal aunts gathered around, peering at the baby and offering congratulations. But Margaret could sense curiosity and a certain judgment in their eyes. They were probably internally criticizing her for having a child before marriage. Margaret, you look tired, Helen approached with a perfect hostess smile. She was wearing a pale blue dress and looked as elegant as always. You should rest a bit. I'll hold Emma for you. Margaret stared at her mother. Helen had never before asked to hold Emma. She hesitated, but feeling the eyes of the relatives around her, reluctantly handed Emma to her mother. Helen awkwardly held her granddaughter and, maintaining her smile, walked across the living room. Margaret watched with bated breath. Margaret. Turning around, she saw her sister Becky entering the room with her husband Brad. Becky was, as always, perfectly polished. She was dressed in a Dior dress with a pearl necklace gleaming at her throat. Becky. Margaret stood up to greet her sister. They exchanged a formal hug. The strong scent of Becky's perfume stung Margaret's nose. Congratulations, Becky said with a smile. Her eyes weren't smiling. So you've discovered your maternal instincts. Thank you, Margaret replied. Mom is holding Emma. Becky's expression clouded for a moment. She turned to look at her mother holding Emma. Well, I never imagined Mom becoming a grandmother, she said in a sarcastic tone. Especially with you becoming a mother first. Margaret caught her breath. Becky's words were clearly filled with envy and resentment. She knew her sister was suffering from not being able to have children, but she hadn't expected such comments on this day. Becky, please, Margaret said quietly. Let's not have any disputes today. Becky gave Margaret a cold look. Of course. Today is your special day, after all. The party progressed, and Margaret kept her eyes on her mother and Emma while conversing with guests. Helen continued holding her granddaughter, while skillfully mingling with the guests. However, when Emma began to cry, she quickly handed the baby to a nearby relative. Time to open presents, Helen announced grandly. Margaret was led to a large table set up in the backyard. A mountain of presents was piled there. She took Emma back in her arms and began opening the gifts one by one, surrounded by guests. This is from Becky and Brad. Helen handed her a box. Margaret opened it and pulled out a set of high-end brand baby clothes. These are lovely, thank you. I picked them out with Mom, Becky smiled. I thought you wouldn't be able to choose things worthy of Emma with your taste. Margaret's cheeks grew hot. Laughter erupted from the crowd. Margaret never had any fashion sense, even as a student, Helen said cheerfully. Remember what she wore to her high school graduation? That was awful. Margaret forced herself to smile. Her mother always enjoyed humiliating her in public. That's right, Becky joined in. I had to rescue her that time. But now I'll use my taste to rescue Emma. More laughter followed, and Margaret hugged Emma closer. It'll be over soon, she told herself inwardly. Late in the afternoon, as the finale of the party, Helen announced a special event. "Everyone, let's move to the backyard," she proclaimed, raising her glass. "Our family has a special tradition. We gather around a bonfire to celebrate the birth of a new life." Margaret looked at her mother in surprise. She had never heard of such a tradition in her family. "Mom, there's no such tradition." "Of course there is," Helen interrupted with a smile. Her eyes gleamed coldly. "Have you forgotten? Our ancestors believed that fire wards off evil spirits." "But Emma is still so small, and it's fine, Margaret," Helen said firmly. "Everyone is looking forward to it. You always disregard family traditions, but just cooperate today." Margaret looked for James, but he was deep in conversation with relatives in a corner of the garden. She took a deep breath and gave up arguing. "All right," she said quietly. The guests began moving to the backyard. Margaret, holding Emma, followed at the back of the group. Dusk was approaching, and the sky was beginning to turn purple. The bonfire preparations were already complete in the backyard. Helen placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Come on, don't keep everyone waiting," she whispered. "Tonight is a special night for you and your daughter." Most of the guests had already gathered around the fire pit set up in the backyard. The sky was bathed in the soft purple of twilight, and the silhouettes of pine trees lining the garden stood out. At Helen's direction, a house servant lit the bonfire, and orange flames rose silently. Margaret held Emma close to her chest, maintaining a safe distance from the fire. Emma was wrapped in a small blanket, showing a peaceful sleeping face. Margaret tried to hide her anxiety, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Everyone, gather around," Helen raised her glass high, illuminated by the light of the bonfire. "Today is a special day. A new life has joined our family." Relatives and friends applauded with smiles. Margaret returned their smiles awkwardly. "The Williams family has an ancient tradition," Helen continued. "When welcoming a new family member, we borrow the purifying power of fire to bless the baby." Margaret frowned. She had never heard of such a tradition. Looking over, she saw that her father James also wore a confused expression. "Now, I want to teach Margaret her first lesson in parenting," Helen said with a smile, "that a mother's duty sometimes involves pain." A sense of confusion spread among the guests. Helen ignored it and approached Margaret. "Now, let me see Emma." Helen reached out her hands. "Let Grandma hold her." Margaret instinctively stepped back. "Mom, she's sleeping. I think it's better not to wake her." "Margaret," Helen's voice had a steely coldness. "Are you defying me in front of everyone?" Margaret felt the eyes of all the guests on her. Feeling uncomfortable and pressured socially, she reluctantly handed Emma to her mother. Helen took Emma and, for the first time, seriously looked at her granddaughter's face. Something in her expression changed. The rigid smile disappeared, replaced by something else. "She's a pretty child," Helen said quietly. Suddenly her gaze turned to Margaret. Her eyes were cold and filled with hatred. "Having a baby before your sister, you're a traitor." Margaret caught her breath. "What are you saying?" "Be quiet." Helen's voice rang sharply. "You've disrupted the family order." The guests were confused, and began to quietly back away. No one had the courage to intervene in this strange turn of events. Mom decided that I would have a child first. Turning around, Margaret saw Becky standing on the opposite side of the bonfire, wineglass in hand. Her face was illuminated by the flames, creating strange shadows. "It's a family tradition," Becky continued. "The second daughter should have children before the firstborn. That's what Mom said." Margaret stared at her sister in disbelief. "What are you talking about? There's no such tradition." "There is." Helen's voice trembled with anger. "My mother was a second daughter. And so was I. Even after marrying into the Williams family, that tradition should have been preserved." Margaret turned to her father. "Dad?" James stepped forward with a confused expression. "Helen, what are you saying? There's no such tradition." "Be quiet." Helen glared at her husband. "This has nothing to do with you." Helen's expression twisted, and she looked down at Emma. "I can't accept this child." Margaret's blood ran cold at those words. "Mom, give Emma back to me," she pleaded. But Helen pretended not to hear, and slowly moved closer to the bonfire. "A child who breaks tradition needs purification." "Mom!" Margaret cried out. Stop. What are you doing? Helen's movements quickened. Holding Emma, she walked toward the bonfire, muttering, "Bad blood must be cleansed." After a moment of frozen terror, Margaret came to her senses and ran toward her mother. "Stop! Give Emma back!" But it was too late. Helen suddenly thrust Emma, wrapped in the blanket, forward and threw her toward the bonfire. "Fire baptism for one with impure blood," Helen shouted. Margaret's scream pierced the night sky. She lunged forward, trying to save her daughter. Becky raised her wine glass and laughed coldly. "Isn't this what you deserve?" In the midst of the confusion, everyone was frozen. But it was James who moved with unexpected swiftness. He leaped toward the bonfire with incredible speed, catching the small bundle of Emma in midair. His right arm touched the flames, and the sleeve of his shirt caught fire. "James!" someone shouted. Her father rolled on the ground, protecting Emma with his body while extinguishing the fire on his arm. Margaret rushed to her father's side. "Emma? Dad!" James, despite his pained expression, handed the small bundle to Margaret. "It's okay. She's safe." Margaret took Emma with trembling hands and pulled back the blanket. Emma was still asleep, unharmed. The thick fabric of the blanket had protected her. Margaret shed tears of relief. However, that relief was short-lived. Turning around, she saw Helen standing in shock. Understanding of what she had done was gradually dawning on her face. Helen stammered. "I was just the tradition." Becky stood silently beside her mother, equally stunned. Her wine glass had fallen and shattered, with red wine spreading across the ground. Margaret hugged Emma tightly and looked at her father. James had red burn marks on his arm and was clearly in pain. But in his eyes burned something she had never seen before. It was anger. Pure, uncontainable anger. He slowly stood up, and after confirming Emma's safety, turned to face Helen. "Margaret, go inside," he commanded in a low voice. "Take Emma to safety." Margaret was surprised by her father's tone. The gentle, mild-mannered father she knew was gone, replaced by someone else entirely. "But Dad, your arm is now..." James's voice allowed no further discussion. Margaret held Emma tightly to her chest and hurried toward the house. Behind her, she heard her father's voice. "For 40 years I've kept silent. But now it's over." Margaret ran into the house, protectively cradling Emma. Looking out the living room window, she could see her father walking toward Helen and Becky. His posture was filled with dignity, and his anger seemed to spread throughout the garden. The guests, in fear and confusion, began to hurriedly leave. Margaret stood by the window and sank to her knees, trembling. Emma showed a miraculously peaceful sleeping face in her arms. Margaret was watching the garden from the living room window. Emma slept peacefully in her arms, but her own heart was beating wildly. Outside the window was a version of her father she had never seen before. James Williams, illuminated by the flames, had transformed from the gentle history professor into a warrior trembling with rage. Helen and Becky stood by the bonfire. Mother and daughter's expressions gradually showed horror and understanding of what they had done. Helen covered her mouth with her hand, while Becky stared at the broken glass at her feet. 40 years, James's voice was low but resonated throughout the garden. "For 40 years I've silently witnessed your violence and control." He took a step toward Helen. His right arm bore the red mark of a burn, and his shirt sleeve was scorched. "James, you don't understand," Helen said with a trembling voice. "I was only trying to preserve tradition. I didn't mean to hurt Emma." "Don't lie." James's angry shout made the remaining guests back away in fear. "You threw your own granddaughter into a bonfire. You call that tradition? I've researched your family's entire history. No such tradition exists." Becky stood in her father's way. "Dad, calm down. Mom was just confused. You were complicit." James looked at Becky with stern eyes. "Always your mother's puppet. I've turned a blind eye to your cruelty toward Margaret. But today, it ends." He grabbed Helen's arm. "Taste what you've done." "James? What are you doing?" Helen's eyes widened in fear. He pushed her toward the bonfire. "You're the one who needs fire purification." "Dad, stop." Becky screamed and lunged to help her mother. Helen stumbled and lost her balance. Becky tried to support her, but both were too close to the bonfire. Suddenly the hem of Helen's dress touched the flames and caught fire. Help! Helen screamed. Becky also caught fire on her sleeve and screamed. Panicked, both desperately struggled to extinguish the flames. Margaret was frozen in terror. The scene she witnessed through the window was like a nightmare. James stood stunned for a moment, but quickly came to his senses and ran to the garden hose. He sprayed water on them, extinguishing the fire. Helen and Becky collapsed to the ground, crying out. They had mild burns on their arms and legs. "Someone call an ambulance," James shouted. One of the remaining guests took out a cell phone and began dialing 911, left the living room on trembling legs, and headed for the front yard. She held Emma to her chest, trying to keep her away from the chaotic scene. The sound of sirens could already be heard from the street. Minutes later, ambulances and police vehicles arrived one after another. Police officers began gathering information from confused witnesses. Paramedics treated Helen and Becky's burns and placed them on stretchers. Turning around, Margaret found her father standing beside her. His arm was wrapped in first aid gauze, and his face showed deep fatigue. But determination resided in his eyes. "Are you all right?" "And Emma?" "We're fine," Margaret answered. "But Dad, your arm." "Don't worry." James placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "For a long time, I was a coward. I let them hurt you. I'll never let that happen again." One of the paramedics approached Margaret. "Ma'am, you and your baby should be checked at the hospital too, just to be safe." Margaret nodded. She looked at James. "Dad, come with us." "Of course," James answered. "I'll go in another ambulance." A police officer approached them. "Can you tell us what happened?" "My wife and younger daughter," James answered quietly, "tried to kill my granddaughter." The officer's expression tightened. "That's a serious accusation. Can you provide details?" "After we get to the hospital," James said. "My daughter and granddaughter's safety comes first." The officer nodded and escorted them to an ambulance. Margaret climbed into the ambulance, holding Emma close. Inside, a paramedic began carefully examining her and Emma. "Miss, your baby is fine," the paramedic reassured her. "It's truly a miracle." "A miracle," Margaret murmured. She looked out the window. She could see Helen and Becky being loaded into another ambulance. Anger and sadness mingled within her. Her mother and sister had tried to harm her child. She couldn't understand how such a thing was possible. James sat beside her. "I'm going to tell the police everything about Helen's years of abuse." "And what happened today?" Margaret stared at her father. "Dad, why did you stay silent all these years?" James heaved a deep sigh. His eyes reflected 40 years of pain and regret. "Shamefully, I feared her. And I loved her. It was blind love." He gazed tenderly at Emma. "But when I saw this child, everything changed. Now I have someone to protect. You and Emma." With sirens blaring, the ambulance sped toward the hospital. Margaret gazed at Emma's tiny face and gently kissed her cheek. "It's okay," she whispered. "Dad and I are here for you." Stars shone quietly in the night sky visible through the ambulance window. Margaret knew that today's events had changed her life forever. But she also felt hope that this change might not necessarily be a bad thing. From the moment her father stood up for her and Emma, a new family had begun. Margaret woke up in a small hospital waiting room. Emma was sleeping in a makeshift bed, prepared by a nurse. Last night's event seemed like a nightmare, but her father's bandaged arm reminded her that it had all been real. The hospital room door opened, and 2 police officers entered. One was a female detective with kind eyes. "Miss Williams, may we speak with you?" Margaret nodded. As the female detective sat beside her, the other officer stood near the door. "You've been through a terrible experience," the detective said quietly. "Your father told us about the situation, and about your family's complex history." Margaret looked out the window. "I never imagined my family would come to this. Growing up in an abusive home is like sitting on a time bomb," the detective said. "Your mother and sister have been transferred to another hospital. They're both receiving treatment for their burns, but arrest warrants have been issued." "What will they be charged with?" "Child endangerment, attempted murder, and domestic violence," the officer answered. "Your father's testimony will be crucial. He says he's going to reveal all the details of 40 years of abuse." Margaret exhaled shakily. She felt a mixture of fear and relief that long-kept secrets would come to light. "Has David been contacted?" She suddenly remembered. "Your father has already contacted him. He's returning on the next flight." The following 2 weeks felt like living someone else's life. Margaret and her father stayed in a hotel, as their house was off-limits due to the police investigation. David returned, and his calm presence soothed her heart. "I'll do anything for you and Emma," he promised. "From now on, we'll move forward together as a family." As trial preparations progressed, Margaret decided for the first time to tell her story. With the help of a hospital counselor, she began preparing to take the stand and testify about the years of abuse and the recent horrific event. On the day of the preliminary hearing, Margaret entered the courtroom on shaky legs. David and her father stood on either side of her. When Helen and Becky were brought in, she caught her breath. Mother and sister had lost their former dignity, dressed in orange prison uniforms and handcuffed. Helen avoided making eye contact, but Becky stared at her. In her eyes floated an emotion Margaret had never seen before. It was remorse. Surprisingly, Becky did not defend her mother. She admitted she had been controlled by Mother, and said in a small voice to Margaret, "I'm sorry." Helen tried to justify her actions until the end. "I was only trying to preserve tradition," she insisted. But the court handed down a severe sentence for their actions. 6 months later, Margaret was living with her father in a new home. Emma was growing healthy, and her wedding to David was scheduled for the following week. Becky was participating in community service and therapy in exchange for a reduced sentence. Gradually freed from her mother's influence, she was finding her true self again. "Are you going to visit her?" David asked Margaret. He was referring to Becky. Margaret looked out at the spring landscape while holding Emma. "I will." She was a victim of Mother, too. That afternoon, Margaret took Emma to visit the rehabilitation facility. Her reunion with Becky began with tears and apologies, and continued with quiet conversation. For the first time, the two sisters truly faced each other. "Real family isn't just about blood ties," Margaret said. "It's about people who protect and love each other." Becky timidly held Emma's tiny hand. Watching this scene, Margaret felt hope for a new beginning.